Part 18 of this series brings me to Genesis chapter 20, immediately after Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham is moving on. Let's think about that for a second. Lot gets not another mention in the story. Lot had been part of Abraham's family. He had grown rich and his tribe had grown as Abraham's had. When they parted, it was because Lot's tribe had grown to a size where there was a conflict between his herdsmen and Abraham's over pastures and grazing rights. Chapter 13, 5-7 says, "And Lot also, which went with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle." Which brings a couple of things to mind. Firstly, it is suggested by the text that Lot was something of a desert sheikh himself, perhaps not up to Abraham's level, but he was obviously a man of means with a substantial following, and it would be reasonable to assume that the men and women of his tribe were of the same stock as Abraham's, in many cases kissing cousins, as was the order of the day. What happened to these people? Are we meant to believe that they arrived on the plains and immediately gave up all their livestock, their only means of livelihood, to join in the debauchery of Sin City? We suddenly find Lot, who is a man with flocks and herds and tents, living in a two up, two down, and his entire retinue depraved to the point where God apparently could not find 10 people on the whole of the plains who had kept their scruples. And what of Abraham's empathy for his kin? This is the man who dropped everything to pursue Chedorlaomer across the border and did battle simply to rescue his nephew. Yet when he is bargaining with God over the fate of the cities of the plain, he makes no mention of this same nephew, or any other of his presumably close relatives on the plain. And when the cities are destroyed, does Abraham venture forth to discover the fate of his nephew? Does anyone in the ongoing story make any reference to an entire portion of their local countryside literally going up in flames? No. So chapter 20 starts with, "And Abraham journeyed from thence towards the south country, and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned in Gerar." Where is chapter 20 following on from? The last we saw Abraham was at the end of chapter 18, when he had finished haggling with God, and Abraham returned to his place. So it would appear that Abraham had a good night's sleep, awoke in the morning to witness, along with his large tribe, the fire and brimstone raining down on the plain within walking distance of where he was, shrugged his shoulders, packed his tent, and headed south. Well, who wouldn't? Now, I'm not one to criticise the make-believes that married couples employ to keep a bit of zest in their love lives, but Abraham's obsession does have me worried. For again, as they approach Gerar, just as when they approached Egypt, and many other times, as the later text suggests, he asks Sarah to pretend she is his sister. Sarah, who is quite willing to debate God's suggestions and quick to confront Hagar, is also happy to go mutely along with Abraham's ruse, knowing it has failed previously and that she will likely end up in another man's bed again. And, surprise, surprise, the ruse works, and Abraham, grand sheikh of the desert, stands idly by as Abimelech takes Sarah for his own. Being aware of the strict morality of the desert folk, and the fact that women were the property of the head of the house, would it not have been a simple task for Abraham to have told 90-year-old Sarah, knowing that she was the hottest piece of property amongst all of the females in his tribe, to keep her stunning nonagenarian face covered, or perhaps even to stay in the tent? But Abimelech takes her and gets a visit from God. Now this must upset a few modern Christians who pray on a daily basis for help and guidance. Throughout the Old Testament, God is popping up all over the place to chat to pagans, heathens, ungodly, unwashed and unworthy, giving them advice and guidance as to how they should run their lives. Yet the modern-day Christian kneels night after night, hands clasped together, whispering to themselves in the vain hope that someone might whisper back. There is a message therein, methinks. God tells Abimelech he is a dead man walking for taking another man's wife. Now, let me reassure you that God is not about to kill Abimelech. just because he unambiguously says that he is going to do so here. God is not going to change his mind, and he is not telling Abimelech an untruth. You can be certain of that. It is simply that here God says, "Thou art but a dead man walking," and in fact Abimelech is not but a dead man walking. Any questions? Now Abimelech, who is apparently quite clear in his mind that he is in conversation with the big I Am, will, nevertheless, immediately following this interlude, continue worshipping pagan gods as if the event had never happened. But for now, Abimelech gets into a heart-to-heart with God. "I never touched her," he says. "They were playing that sister and brother game." He continues. "I am innocent in thought and deed," he concludes. God then says that he knows Abimelech was pure in his thoughts, and that he, God, intervened to prevent Abimelech from innocently cuckolding Abraham. God intervened? He disobeyed the prime directive? So much for free will then. If his omniscience can intervene here to stop an innocent man from innocently doing wrong, why can he not always do so? Why not simply prevent Abraham from coming up with the cockeyed sibling story in the first, second or nth place? Or intervene to stop Sarah playing along with the oft-failed idea? He certainly wasn't doing it here to teach Abimelech a lesson. Abimelech wasn't even going to start worshipping the being he now unquestionably understood to be the creator and destroyer of all. And omniscient God knew that nothing positive would come of this episode, except perhaps that Abimelech would load up Abraham with even more wealth as a reward for his, Abraham's, duplicity. But if God had wanted Abraham to have more goats, he could have just poofed them into existence. So God tells Abimelech that if he gives Sarah back, Abraham will pray and make it all right, but that if he doesn't, then he and all his people will die. Of course, God already knows what Abimelech will do. Abimelech tells all his people about his meeting with God, and they were sore afraid. Not so afraid that they will not all forget about this and go back to their pagan ways the next day. Perhaps a bit sore afraid would be more accurate. Abimelech then reproaches Abraham, and Abraham whines, "Don't you wish your girlfriend was hot like my 90-year-old half-sister wife?" And then he explains that he has been passing Sarah off as his sister everywhere for years. Apparently the Bible's only detailing the 2 times he was caught out. How many other men had been captivated by Granny's good looks and bedded her in between, we are not told. Abraham is then given sheep, oxen, men servants and women servants, in order of importance, in payment for the deception which almost cost Abimelech and everyone in Gerar their lives. Abimelech then tells Sarah that he has given Abraham 1,000 pieces of silver, which was an impressive achievement considering coinage would not exist for another millennia or more. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. For the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech, because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. How long was Sarah with Abimelech? It couldn't have been a couple of days, because no one in Gerar would have noticed that they were infertile, unless Sarah was with Abimelech for a few months. So we have to assume that a minimum of 3 months, but likely many more, had passed. How long would it take before a townspeople collectively noticed that no women were getting pregnant, and that it was an unusual occurrence? Which means that we must also believe that Abimelech, having just added the hoary Hebrew Helen of Troy to his harem, decided not to dust her off for months on end. Such is belief. And what is the very next thing that happens after Sarah has spent a few months in Abimelech's harem? She tells Abraham, Abes, wouldn't you know it, but God visited me last night and now I'm pregnant. And Abraham, at 99, who presumably had been trying for many decades to achieve this very feat, and with as much renewed vigour as a pensioner can raise since God first told him to expect a son 25 years ago, and ignoring the fact that Sarah has just shared a tent with another man for several months, says, "Brilliant! Is it just possible that Sarah took things into her own hands? That it was her idea to pass herself off as Abraham's sister all those times? An idea that she convinced Abraham was his own, so that she could find a man to give her what Abraham could not? Of course she would be found out eventually on each occasion, such is the gossip of the world, but finally Abimelech achieved what the others could not. I know it's a highly unlikely story, being that Sarah was supposedly 90, but if we ignore the always inflated ages of the Bible, then I like to think Sarah was more in control of her fecundity than her obviously one sheep short of a flock husband. So Isaac is born, and Abraham immediately mutilates him as God commanded. Sarah, having a son of her own, then decides to kick Hagar and Ishmael out of the house. This is odd, knowing as we do that it was common custom for women to use slaves as surrogate mothers. Are we to believe that Sarah, having taken Ishmael as her own son, holds no paternal feelings towards him at all after these years? Apparently not. Abraham, who it seems cares more for Ishmael than Sarah, is troubled by this turn of events, but God pops down yet again to smooth his furrowed brow. "Do as your wife commands," says God. "I'll take care of the kid." Of course, God could have said this to Hagar or Ishmael, or Abraham could have passed the message on, which would have saved Hagar and Ishmael some physical and mental stress. But hey, who am I to criticise the big cheese? So Abraham kicks Hagar out into the southern Canaan desert with nothing but a bread roll and a bottle of water. Hagar carries the bread, water, and Ishmael on her shoulder, see below, and wandered lost in the wilderness, and her water was soon gone. Knowing her kid was about to die, Hagar pops him down under a bush and sits herself down a good way off so that she does not have to witness the tragedy of her infant. Except that Ishmael was 17 years old when all this happened. He was all but a grown man. Are we to believe that they wandered so long that a strapping 17-year-old, being carried all the time on his mother's shoulders, gave up the ghost before she did? Apparently so. God has now had enough of watching this misery below him unfold and decides to pop down for another chat with Hagar. Of course, Hagar trusts God after his last intervention when she was forced to return to Sarah for a beating. "Lift up your strapping 17-year-old son and hold him in your hands," says God. "I will make him a great nation." And God made a well appear. Well, it was the least he could do after witnessing Hagar's amazing clean and jerk. God does like this unnecessary drama. It's almost as if this story was written to be told around a campfire, with sex, violence, intrigue, natural disasters, jeopardy, heroic quests, and the supernatural all mixed together, with Tarantino's flair for invention, but a 4-year-old's flair for continuity and consistency. Anyway, God looks after Ishmael, he becomes a hunter, and his mother gets him a wife out of Egypt. Abraham, as always, moving on and not at least concerned by the fate of his son, then comes across Abimelech again. Abimelech asks Abraham to promise that God will treat him and his descendants well, because he has treated Abraham well. Abraham sees no reason to consult God on the matter and makes a promise on God's behalf. He and Abimelech then conclude a covenant and clear up a confusion over a well which apparently Abraham had dug in Abimelech's territory. This involved Abraham giving Abimelech 7 lambs, though in fact in written Hebrew the words 7 and swearing are identical. No vowels, of course. This convoluted and pointless story appears simply to explain away the origin of the name Beersheba, which is translated from the Hebrew as well of swearing or well of 7. As I've said elsewhere, in a land of desert, wells are very important. The location of the wells would have to be learned and passed down from generation to generation. Before maps and writing, it was stories told around campfires which would impress important knowledge onto the minds of the young. It's therefore easy to imagine how locations of wells would feature strongly in the oral history and traditions of a nomadic, desert-dwelling people. And Abraham then wandered in the land of the Philistines. Of course, the Philistines may not have existed for another 700 years, but Abraham wandered in their lands nonetheless. And that's it for now. Next time, did Abraham, or did he not, sacrifice Isaac? Or 2 men went up a mountain, but only 1 man came down? Thanks, as always, for watching.